Welcome everyone to another episode of the Fire These Times. I'm your host Elia Ayoub, and we are going to have a conversation with Romeo Kokriatski, a repeated guest on this podcast and a Ukrainian journalist based in Kiev, about what's been happening with Ukraine, in Ukraine, around Ukraine. As many people probably listening to this already know by now, the shit show over the past few days now is obviously already having an impact. And so I figured I'd have Romeo on to talk about it all. Romeo, how are you?
I've been better.
Yeah, well, I think that's a fair answer. We, I mean, the first question is a bit on that anyway. It is like, how have you been experiencing these past few, however long whenever you want to start, really, as a Kiev-based journalist who's also obviously Ukrainian.
It's so hard to say because, to be honest, I'll start off with this. From my perspective, and from my perspective since the start of the full scale invasion, I have sort of been aware that this is the more or less the path that the invasion was going to take. That it would be a long, drawn out conflict,
Mhm.
that there would be back and forth. I think I even have a piece I wrote around the start of the full scale invasion that literally says that it's going to be this back and forth. There's going to be diplomatic kerfuffles. There's going to be all the like kind of good and bad news that comes with war, and this is to be expected. I was never under the illusion that this was going to be a quick conflict or that it would be settled in anything like a reasonable amount of time, simply because Vladimir Putin is not a reasonable man. And as a result, most of these past 3 years, I've been focusing on trying to maintain my equilibrium, and not always been successful. There are times when there are drone strikes a little too close to my apartment, and I don't really feel great about that. There's times where there are mass strikes somewhere else, and we have just massive civilian casualties, and also not the best feeling. And obviously, I go through the typical mood swings. I'm burnt out beyond belief, but I do try to maintain my kind of equanimity, I guess I should say. This is not always as simple as it seems, not just because of what goes on, but because the fact is, most people do not think deeply about complex topics. Especially, most people, especially, don't think about war. They don't want to think about war when it's something that impacts you personally. Um, you don't ever want to think about it. You want to go back to a world where there was no war and it
Mhm.
was not even a topic of conversation. But since most people are not as miserable as I am, their emotions tend to swing more widely than mine, and I end up kind of feeling that myself, feeling that tension myself, even if I intellectually understand that, well, like, oh, I know Trump's going to cut off aid, or well, obviously the strikes are going to increase as our Patriot stocks deplete. No, I know all this intellectually, but then um, and I can even convince myself of to like calm down. This is fine. You know what's gonna happen. But when you see everyone else like running around, um, not quite panicking, but incredibly depressed, like with incredibly low morale, it's hard to maintain that equanimity. It's hard not to succumb to everyone else's despair, even if I am constantly thinking, look, I know the way this ends, and until that happens, there's no point in mourning about it.
And so is this mostly, we'll also get into the geopolitics and all of that, but like, is this mostly a reaction you see around you? Is it online? Is it a bit of both?
It's mostly around me. Like I pay attention to people when I
Hmm.
go for walks, or I'm riding public transit, or I'm just listening to colleagues and random snatches of street conversation. This is like that's just kind of my sense of things, is that people were really hopeful, and I will absolutely get into this later. But I can just say for now that people were really hopeful that the war would end this year, because of Trump. That was like a legitimately widespread and held belief, and not a belief held really with any kind of like factual basis. It was an article of faith because people are tired of the war. Um, like, of course, everyone wants peace and everyone was hoping for this. And when it didn't work out that way, even though, again, I could have told you to anyone this, lots of people could have told you that there was never, this is a giant nothing burger. But people had kind of hyped themselves up that this is it. It's finally going to be over. They're going to come to some kind of agreement, and maybe we won't get everything we want, but we'll finally have some sort of peace. And that really, the fact that that isn't happening is a big blow to a lot of people.
Yeah, I guess I can't expect everyone to have followed the RNC, the Republican National Convention, as I did at the time. We'll talk about this a bit because it's relevant to this specific conversation. Um, there is an element of Trump's own, or Trump's team's, whatever, his own PR and propaganda that like he's the guy who doesn't want headaches and he's the guy who doesn't want, foreign conflict and he doesn't want all of that. And the only way to do this would be to
Yep.
like force a peace or whatever. And I even myself obviously in the Palestine world, there were people who were imagining that. It's more understandable, I think, in the Palestine space just because Joe Biden was definitely an accessory in the genocide, whereas when it comes to Ukraine, at the very least, like more outwardly supportive. And with Trump, the question mark was with people is like how worse can it get? Obviously with Gaza, and I think unfortunately he may show us how worse it can get. Um, I mentioned the RNC. I'll bring that up quickly, and it's not kind of the focus of this conversation, but in terms of what the priority of so for those who don't know, it's like the big thing that the Republicans and then the Democrats had their own thing separately in the US, where they at least formally appointed Trump as the nominee or confirmed him as the nominee or whatever, even though it was, of course, known for years that this would be the case. And at that convention, I'll plug the podcast that could happen here because I listened. They did that. They went there. I mean, so I listened to the 5 days it was or 3 days. Or I don't know how long it was, and they mentioned that there was three dominant themes among the Republicans that was pretty consistent throughout like all of the speeches and whatever, which is the two of them is what most people I think would expect, immigration, immigrants, etc., demonizing immigrants, demonizing trans people and dehumanizing trans people. And the third one was Ukraine. It wasn't even Israel-Palestine, which I think would surprise many people. Some people did mention that, and but it was like one of those like they didn't need to talk about it because everyone, they Palestinians are terrorists or whatever. They didn't need to kind of bring it up. But when it came to Ukraine, that I think surprised quite a few people. It's like, why are they this obsessed with Ukraine? And there is a range of all of this. There are those who are like overtly pro-Russia, although at the RNC they wouldn't say so this openly. They would say so in other settings. And you had those who were just like America first, isolationists, nationalists, whatever you want to call them. And they kind of converged because ultimately they kind of wanted the same thing. Um, Given that since Trump was actually elected, you said that like many people were at least hopeful that like maybe in his infinite chaos or whatever, that would be some kind of, I don't know, agent of de facto peace or something. Given that that's not happening now, you mentioned like a lot of people are panicking, the mood is clearly down. Um, and I would suspect, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that the showdown between if I want to call it that. I hate all of these terms. Between Vance, Trump, of course, basically yelling at Zelensky and Zelensky trying in his third language to reason with these two madmen. Um, how has that shifted things? I would imagine for the worse.
I mean, there's a little bit of a disconnect, I think, between some groups of people that I've seen. So obviously, I'm a working journalist. I work at a like actual newspaper, news magazine, I guess. Um, and a lot of my colleagues, you could very charitably describe as Ukrainian intelligentsia, right? These are highly educated, highly connected people who are constantly talking to influential people and decision makers and explaining it and blah blah blah. Um, and there seems to be, I won't say broad consensus, but there seems to be a sense among that kind of set that Zelensky should have been more. accommodating. But that is not the sense you get from people in general. In general, like everyone's watched that exchange, absolutely everyone, and it is completely clear to, I don't know, I'm betting you could pluck a man who had grown up in the woods with wolves for company and show him that clip, and he would be able to tell you who the asshole is. It is so entirely obvious that like uh, everyone feels at least some defensiveness when it comes to Zunky when they watch that clip, because it's impossible not to see your own president get just like mauled verbally and not feel something. Um, and we saw his poll numbers had like this a pretty substantial like 20% jump or something. Like clearly people think that he stood up for himself and he should have stood up for himself. But I would say that that's probably more like the average citizen and less the more kind of politically aware um, intelligentsia type.
Fair enough. Yeah, I would. I mean, this is not representative of anything, but everyone I know was like go Zelensky, just because no one likes Trump and Vance, and it was just so such a nauseating sight. I didn't even watch the entire thing. I just couldn't go through it, but I did like watch most of it, and it just was such a nauseating sight to behold. Knowing that Zelensky a few years ago, I know like did barely spoke English, and this is his third language basically, and he managed to confront these two men who clearly had this alternative agenda. At the very least, Vance was, and Trump in his semi-senile state was plucking along as well. Um, the One of the questions we've been asking folks on Blue Sky as well, like on the from the periphery handle, to like what kind of questions do they have, especially since the quote unquote showdown. And one of the questions I guess is I guess an obvious one with many people, and it's certainly the subject of many op-eds, which is like what do you think are likely scenarios right now? Not necessarily to predict, but like what are some educated guesses one can have in terms of given that the US is becoming I'll list a few things for listeners in case they don't know it, so they don't get lost in all the details. But we know that they're suspending aid, military aid. We know that they have stopped fighting Russian disinformation. They fired the people who would something like that. And if you know more of the details, please go for it. And we know that Europe is responding by increasing its, or at least announcing that they will increase the spending budget. I think today I saw Ursula von der Leyen putting the numbers as like up to 800 billion euros or something like that. So things are shifting very, very quickly. You mentioned on Blue Sky, it was a few days ago. I think it was you were quote tweeting, quote posting, whatever. What someone was saying, I forgot the details, but the person was saying something like, without America, Ukrainians cannot help them defend themselves or something like that. And you mentioned it's not even that, it's just that America has the best guns, has the best toys, has the best weapons, whatever. Given that that's the case, and with the very real possibility that the United States will no longer send those, what do you think could happen?
The main effect here is just greater civilian deaths. Um, to be honest, at this stage of the war, American, like purely American arms are not decisive by themselves. Because first, a lot of the NATO kit that the US has sent over is also used by other NATO member countries, and they've also sent some of theirs over. Uh, a lot of the munitions for these NATO systems are manufactured in Europe. The real issue is the fact, really, it does come down basically to Patriots. For those that don't know, Patriot missile batteries are anti-aircraft systems, or anti-air systems, I should say. In Ukraine, they are primarily used to intercept Russian ballistic missiles, cruise missiles. Reportedly, we intercepted a hypersonic missile once. In general terms, it is an incredibly effective system. I think the given rate is something between 94 to 96% effective interception rate. This is really, really high. For comparison, the most common Soviet anti-air system, the S-300, has something, I think it's 50 or 60% ish interception rates. They are way, way worse at their jobs. Um, so the reason this matters mostly for civilians is because Russia typically uses their missile strikes and drone strikes on civilian targets. They do not use them on the military front lines, at least not in the kind of mass attack sense that we have pretty much every night here, maybe multiple times a night or day even. Mostly these, like, their missiles especially are usually lobbed at industrial targets, which are typically located within cities, though their aim is not always the best. So the Patriots are used to defend cities, and that cities are where people live. So if you have less ways to defend your cities where your people live, more people are going to die. Like the math is real simple there. It is we of course do have other ballistic like interception systems, but again, just none of them even come close to the efficiency and effectiveness of Patriots. And unlike the majority of the equipment that we've received from the U.S., Patriot missiles are only manufactured in the United States. We cannot make them. Europe can't make them. If the U.S. doesn't want to sell you Patriots, you're not getting Patriots. Is pretty much how it goes. So yeah, just lots more civilian deaths. Again, I doubt it's going to really have that much of an impact on the battlefront itself. But in the rear, yeah.
Maybe this is too detailed up to you, but why wouldn't it have an impact on the battlefront?
Because first off, a lot of the tactics used in the war have changed. Um, the I don't know, dronization of the military is like it's an ongoing process, and it is constantly changing how everyone is fighting. So a lot of like again, you don't really get troop concentrations to lob ballistic missiles at unless these are newly, freshly mobilized troops at training bases, which we had a strike just a few days ago that killed something like 30 soldiers and wounded something like 100 somethings, 130 soldiers, because a Russian missile was able to, well, the Russians were able to discover the site of a training facility and strike it. Uh, and again, you don't really have that concentration on the front. Teams are very dispersed, groups are very small on purpose because you don't want to have like a single target, a single strike that wipes out 200 people. The government has actually opened criminal investigations into the strike because they believe it should have never happened, and maybe they're right. Who knows? The so that's why on the battlefield, the you don't really need to intercept that many cruise missiles. That's not where the cruise missiles are going. The cruise missiles are going into cities. For and like I said, for the other stuff, it will be tight, but a lot of it has been replaced either by domestic variants or the Europeans make them. It's granted an assumption on my part, but my assumption is the Europeans are going to continue making and sending us whatever stuff they can make without the Americans' permission, which is a fair bit of stuff. And especially since Europe likely is not going to be that interested in seeking Trump's permission going forward. I think Trump's made it quite clear he has no intention of helping us.
I mean, yeah, I think everyone's expecting tariffs on the EU to start at some point well, now he's already put them on Canada, Mexico, and China anyway, as well as the UK, although for the UK, I don't actually know what the details are yet. So I do expect, and like Trump I mean, unsurprisingly, I suppose, but like he's extremely unpopular in Europe. Even the far right here, which has to navigate the fact that it both loves Trump and Putin, is having difficulties doing so very openly because those are two very unpopular figures in Europe at the moment. There was the leader of the far right party in France, Bardella, Le Pen's party, who was supposed to speak at that, not the RNC, the CPAC or something, a few days ago.
The thing in Hungary, right?
Yeah, yeah. A few days ago, and he ended up canceling the day. He was supposed to speak the day after Bannon, but because Bannon did that Sig Heil, he actually canceled. Because in France, it's still unpopular to do that. So it's just one of those things that it's kind of a big question mark as to how much this global coalition of the far right is able to sustain itself because they have a lot of internal contradictions. As far as Europe is concerned, in any case, we saw, for example, Meloni, who before being elected was pretty openly pro-Putin, and then after being elected, did like a 180 shift and is very vocally, I wouldn't say that vocally, but in terms of politics, is on the side, quote unquote, on the side of Ukraine.
Well, I would
Has
say
this,
she's kind of moderating now. She said
yeah.
a few days ago that she will not be permitting Italian troops to join any future
Mhm.
peacekeeping effort at all. So I wouldn't say she's as firmly as on our side as we would like.
No, 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 separate in quotation. It's one of those like we don't know where the shift of bat like I do genuinely believe that if it gets to the point where more far right got more of the far right takes over different more governments basically, then that it will shift the overton of window even more to the right and the politicians like Meloni that at least pay lip service to Ukraine from time to time would like they wouldn't feel the need to do so in the same way anymore. It certainly doesn't come from like a point of genuine support or anything like that. Um, One thing that I wanted us to get into, you and I actually don't know if this was on your podcast, which is Ukraine Without Hype, because I went on it once or twice in the past few years. That I made this point. I certainly made it on some podcast at some point, which is that at the time, so 3 years ago now, more or less, when it started, the full scale one anyway. I had a sense, based on like my reading of the situation in Syria, that any kind of support that the Europeans especially will have towards Ukraine has some kind of expiration date. Now, this is mod like that prediction is kind of moderated by the fact that this basically depends on how much the Europeans feel that they are themselves under threat. But in terms of um, taking Ukraine seriously and taking Ukraine seriously in terms of having its own agency, that's very much something that's been like fluctuating. We saw this, I guess, I don't know if we still see, I guess we still do, like this divide between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, with Eastern Europe, broadly speaking, be more on the we need to support Ukraine at all costs because we might be next, and because supporting Ukraine is good kind of side of things, whereas Western Europe, it kind of fluctuates. Like, is it even an electoral thing? Is it not? Is it part of the election cycle? Is it not? I saw I think it was in The Guardian about a year ago, there was a poll, Europe-wide poll of attitudes towards Ukraine. And while most were pro-Ukraine, what I found interesting, if not a bit distressing or depressing, is that most people did not expect, basically were saying that Ukraine cannot win. And this was like, 2 years into the full-scale invasion, where Ukraine has actually managed to hold its own after 2 years, when many analysts were predicting that, Ukraine would collapse in a week or whatever in the early days. But it seems like almost not like Ukraine, whatever it does, and whatever they do, whatever Ukrainians do, basically, that is always going to be the sense, at least in Western Europe, and this is a generalization I recognize, that like, well, Russia is just a behemoth. It's too big. It can't be defeated. And that ultimately there has to be some kind of settlement and that's it basically. What has your kind of what's your reading on all of this?
I have kind of an anecdote for this. Well, not
Go
really
for
an
it.
anecdote, but I'm a pretty short guy. I am in imperial terms 5'4" in metric 1.63, 62, something like this, I think.
Thank you for the metric because I have no idea what that one is.
Which for the US is quite short. Americans are fucking tall motherfuckers. And I would, as a result of being quite short, I'd be bullied. I'd be picked on. Well, I was short, I was round, I was brown. Um, I read a lot. I didn't care about sports. So I was very much the typical kind of
And
nerd
you
that
and you
people
grew
would
up
pick
or
on.
you lived in the US for a long time.
Yes, yes. I grew up in New York. I also lived in Richmond, Virginia for a bit, in Albany, New York for a bit. Um, and as I was growing up, I would be picked on, and I dislike being picked on. I would often like shoot back or argue back. And I remember at one point, I think I was somewhere in middle school, and this guy was like making fun of me. I started making fun of him back. Uh, and he started like daring me to hit him. And absolutely all of like it was like a middle school. I think it was like the gym. Like we were in the changing room at the gym after like PE or something. And everyone, you know how kids do. They gather in a circle and everyone's like fucking yelling. And everyone's like, well, they were telling me that if I like did anything to this guy, he'd fucking like kill me because he was like giant ass motherfucker. And again, I'm quite small. Uh, and my sense of that wasn't that these were concerned people that were warning me. My sense was these were cowards who wanted to see their cowardice reinforced. They wanted to see that their cowardice was proven correct. That the correct move when a small man or a small force is facing a much bigger, stronger force is to give in. That's always how I felt throughout my entire life because I've been short and brown my entire life. And a lot of people uh, used to think that they could fuck with me because of that. And a lot of people would advise me to not pick fights, and I would pick fights with teachers and with cops, with fucking everyone, because I really dislike being fucked with. And I think when you're being fucked with, it doesn't fucking matter who your opponent is. Your job is to make them stop fucking you. And that the only way to do that, in my experience, is to fucking punch them until they stop. And yeah, they might be bigger, but I've never lost a fight. I haven't won many either, but most of the time, uh, they will stop fighting if they see that you are causing them enough pain. You don't have to win. You don't have to like, you just have to cause the other guy enough pain that he thinks trying to cause further harm to you will result in more harm than he is willing to take for himself. The point of resistance when you are much smaller than your opponent is not to beat them in some rocky ass show where people declare you the greatest martial artist of the world. It is to make your resistance painful enough that they cannot swallow you, that they understand that hurting you will hurt them, and hurting you will hurt them enough that they will not want to hurt you. That is the goal of fighting back. And this is what, in my experience, most people fail to understand. They think only in winning or losing. But it's not about winning or losing, it's getting people to stop hurting you. And that isn't a win lose proposition. um, that's
And so
something
how
you
would
can
you,
accomplish.
yeah, for sure. And so how would you account for well, you partly answered it anyway, but the difference in attitudes that we have seen, uh, at least in, again, it's a bit of a generalization, but between Western Europe and Eastern Europe on these things, is it quite literally just the fact that Eastern Europe is more familiar with Russia?
Um, Mostly yes. I also think a big unspoken part of it is the very pacifistic nature of modern Western society, especially European society. American society is still is pretty violent. European society is much less inclined to violence. It's much less inclined to view violence positively or view depiction of violence positively. And I think a lot of Western Europeans, for them, war really is just unthinkable. It is so far removed from their lived experience that the very concept is just barbaric. And this is why they would prefer there just not being conflict. Conflict icky, makes me feel weird, gotta think about stuff that I don't like strength and power and all of that. Um, this honestly, this is what I think drives most of that kind of Western European defeatism. Not even the fact that they are less threatened by Russia, but simply because modern Western society is incredibly peaceful, which in most cases would be like a very good thing. Unfortunately, we are currently not in a stage of history where it would be.
Yeah, and I thought about this a bit as to why, because in the UK it is slightly different in the sense that I do think it's likely because there have been more direct attacks by the Russians in the UK in terms of the Skripal poisoning and all that stuff. That is that Skripal? Yeah, I think it was. That it's kind of more, I guess, in people's minds. In any case, it was more
I
of a
don't know. In
bipartisan.
Germany, the Russians like tried to kill the Rheinmetall CEO. They've tried to kill a
True.
bunch of Czech defense industry people. Like
Mm.
the Russians have done plenty of attacks in Europe. They just react to them less.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, that makes
And
sense. That
again,
makes
I think
sense.
it's just because they have such an ingrained avoidance of violent conflict.
Hmm.
Violent conflict, I'd say that they cannot mediate through a colonial lens.
And so, do you think this could change now that the things are happening the past few
Yes,
days?
absolutely. I think
Mm.
that I wrote an op-ed about this, which hopefully will be published somewhere at some point. Um, but in the op-ed, I basically argued that Europe has to, like, Europe will militarize. It's not that it has to or it is a choice. Europe has no option. This is a future that will happen. You will see a united EU military because otherwise, the fact is Russia is going to invade the Baltics. I don't know if they care about invading Germany and Poland and the EU and the Netherlands and Belgium. No idea. But they absolutely do want the Baltics. They probably want pieces of Poland. They probably want pieces of Romania. They are going to attack European countries if they are victorious in Europe. One of the things that I think that I mentioned in my op-ed was that there's this new axis. If people remember the history, the axis is what we call the evil powers, World War II. But there's a new axis that isn't wholly united by ideology. It's not quite all fascism. It is united by countries that all want to overturn the post World War II norm that you cannot change territories by force. They are in some ways opposed to each other. They are in some ways antagonistic to each other, but they all share that singular goal of getting rid of that norm, which is why Donald Trump is going in this isolationist way, because the guarantor of territorial sovereignty, has practically been the United States for the past 70 years. And without that, the Europeans do realize, I don't think it's have to or might, I think they do realize that there is no one upholding that norm at the moment. And there is a lot of countries that want bits of Europe.
That makes sense. It is one of those things we'll have to probably do like more deep dive on what the implications of all of this, because I do think also there's been an element of this kind of it being inevitable. Maybe if Harris had won, I don't know, but since the results of the elections in the US, I think this path has been more and more likely every day. And I think these past few days have, I mean, as you've seen, I think just today or yesterday, Ursula von der Leyen announced the 800 billion, and it does seem to be where they're going basically with that.
I mean, let's
Um,
think about it.
yeah,
When Trump does launch an invasion in Mexico, Europe will have to do something. They'll have to at least say something. And what if the
yeah,
Mexicans appeal to the EU for military aid against their NATO ally?
yeah.
Like these are questions that Europe must now be answering. And I guarantee you, there's a lot of people in Brussels that are running around like they're chickens with their heads cut off, blood spurting out of the stump, trying to figure out what the fuck do we do if Trump starts, setting troops into Toronto.
It does seem that they really relied on the hope that it would not be Trump again, that it would basically be Harris. And there
This
doesn't
was
seem to have
the
been much
entire
of
world.
a yeah, yeah, and that but basically that there wasn't kind of a plan B ready in the same way, really, of like what would
Nope.
happen in this kind of scenario. Um, which is incredible in and of itself, but whatever. Um, we've
The
gotten to the
Biden
point.
administration did not have a transition plan for Trump. The
No,
Biden administration, they were
no.
100% sure that Harris would win.
Yeah, I mean it doesn't now it doesn't matter, but like they didn't even have a plan for like him not running in the first place. But
Oh yeah,
um you did mention something. Okay, this is different path of this conversation slightly, but you mentioned we may be entering something that's more dangerous than campism. This is like we're in our pre-chat. Get into this a bit because I feel it's one of those dimensions in this conversation or in conversations like this one that's usually not as explored as I think it could be.
so Joey, you and I and our kind of group of acquaintances and friends have long been talking about what Layla dubbed as the anti-imperialism of fools. We had a very fantastic podcast that I think still holds up even now. Um, if you're interested, give it a listen. It's a fantastic episode. where we discuss literally this topic. Um, and one of the one there, I wouldn't say this was like a consensus. It seemed clear at the time that the U.S. left was reflexively anti-American. Whatever America did, they would oppose just on instinct because America bad. Um, but a very interesting thing has happened. Well, I say interesting, has happened with the U.S. left, especially after Trump and the Zelensky meeting. They still hate Ukraine. They are celebrating the end of military aid to Ukraine. They are celebrating Trump's like foreign actions here. They are celebrating Trump's foreign policy, and that I'm pretty sure indicates that they are not as reflectively anti-American as one would think. It's not a case of America bad. It really does seem to be the case of when America. It seems to be more isolationist and more parochial than just America bad.
Yeah.
Um, like you can stumble into a good opinion if your base position is America bad. I let's be honest, you could look at a lot of places and a lot of conflicts, and under the very simplistic model of American bad, you probably won't be too far off the truth. However, if your model is simply America shouldn't do anything abroad, uh, that is quite frankly that's really concerning because that even abandons the pretense of empathy. Like it abandons even the pretense of considering foreigners humans, not Americans humans. And it makes me worried uh, of the jingoism that the current American government is showing towards its literal geographic neighbors and what the reaction would be because I'm no longer like I've already seen the US left joke about Canada being annexed. um what happens if those aren't just pure jokes and there are people that just legitimately don't care? Not that I don't expect the US left will support naked American imperialism against Canada and Mexico, but I think they will not care. And that really indicates a much deeper rot in their very conception of what the fuck leftism is than them simply being, well, America's involved, so it's bad.
Yeah, yeah, that's the thing. I mean, there's no serious engagement for the most part on concept like even like the right to intervene or the right to R2P, sorry, the right to protect, which is in the UN. There's no serious engagement with most things that require very messy, complicated, call it geopolitical, call it
I
whatever
mean,
you
I've
want.
seen them. I'm seeing they've been celebrating the end of USAID.
Yeah,
The like, oh, it's a CIA front. Even if it's a CIA front, they fucking distribute TB medicine.
yeah.
Like they distribute food aid. What? Fine, it's a fucking CIA front. Would you prefer people to die of tuberculosis and starvation? Is that the world you would prefer to live in? Because it's not the world I would prefer to live in.
I don't
I
think it
would
goes.
prefer my spies did more humanitarian aid, in fact. Maybe they just stop doing the spying and just focus on the humanitarian aid part. Wouldn't
I
that be
mean,
nice?
we've seen the estimates of what this could actually lead, and it's very ugly. The number of deaths could be in the millions. At the very least, we're going to have a pretty a steep
No more
increase in
HIV testing
yeah,
programs.
yep,
No
HIV,
more
tuberculosis, polio.
pandemic, like no more joint pandemic monitoring things that we
Yeah,
set up after COVID,
yeah.
which barely had time to start working, started warning about bird flu and measles and count, and that's all done now. So if COVID starts, we won't know. There's a
It
good
just
chance we
speaks.
won't just won't know.
But that's the thing.
People
It
will be
just
dropping
speaks to
dead, and everyone
this.
will be going, "Huh."
That's the thing. It just speaks to this. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm repeating myself a bit. It just speaks to this inability or unwillingness, or whatever, to understand that we already live in an interconnected world. And the way I kind of pictured them picturing things, and obviously I cannot know for certain, but it does seem consistent if I apply this model with how they actually express themselves, or at least online and in writing, is that they imagine what needs to happen is for some big collapse of whatever everything America related is, like the American Empire, whatever, has to all collapse. Then we can start from zero. they kind of picture this, and then we can rebuild from fresh or whatever. You can
That's
rebuild
because they
better or
don't
whatever.
believe the rest of the world exists. That's why they
Exactly.
think if America collapses,
Exactly.
it's fine. All they have to
Exactly.
do is just rebuild things in America, and the rest of the world, it just stuff will happen there. It's far away. Who cares? Something will happen. They'll figure it out.
It's also it's a bizarre kind of also admission that like ultimately this type of quote unquote anti-imperialism did not even understand the extent to which this world has become American, whatever you want to call it, like how big the influence of the US is, and that this necessarily means that there are certain responsibilities that comes with it, rather than just acting like, all we need to do is to withdraw and basically what Biden did in Afghanistan or whatever, and then kind of wash our hands and stop thinking about it the next day. It really does seem to be like the prevailing sentiment, and this is the same for the most part as like the MAGA far right, and there has to be a recognition at some point or some kind of reckoning, I wanted to say, with like where does this even lead? Like it's not something to it is for me fundamentally conservative type of politics if the instinct is this is too much and we may fuck up or we may cause problems, therefore we need to avoid dealing with it altogether, because usually when that happens, well, someone else is going to deal with it, obviously, as Russia is trying to do in Ukraine. But it's I'm still baffled by elements of this. I mean, there's like an element, there's part of me that's like, oh, I'm taking this, I don't know, I put this intellectual hat on and I'm trying to understand why does, sociological analysis or whatever. But like fundamentally on this like emotional level, it's still baffling. And I've been looking at it for, well, literally a decade now, since 2014, 2015. It still baffles me.
Maybe I can shed some light here as someone
Yeah.
who was unfortunately made to spend most of his childhood and teenage years in the US. Uh, Americans are incredibly isolationist. They would really prefer if there was no greater world, if America just floated on a fucking platonic sea of just America. This is the preferred like existence for almost all Americans. It doesn't matter what political framework you have or what ideology you hold. Almost all Americans are reflexively isolationist. Um, they don't want to think about the rest of the world. They don't want anything to do with the rest of the world. When the rest of the world comes in the form of immigrants, well, um, we get Donald Trump, and this is why. And as much as I thought in my youth that, well, like the left obviously shouldn't be that way because, again, international solidarity was something I thought was fundamental, just core fundamental to being a leftist. That's not the case. They would really prefer the rest of the world burn as long as they have nothing to do with it. And the fact that American megacorps rapaciously rape the planet for profit, it's not our problem. We don't run the megacorps. The fact that the U.S. constantly sues smaller countries into gaining economic benefits. We don't care. We're not the government. Just a complete abdication of any sort of responsibility for anything, and then a refusal to to take any accountability for the harms that have been done. Because, well, I didn't vote for them. I don't vote. They're all it's all a fascist empire. Yeah, like buddy, sure it is, but you live in it. You pay taxes in it. You like participate in that society. Even if you lived in a fucking hut in the woods, I would still expect you to hold at least some emotional accountability for what your nation does. But no, that's not how Americans think. The rest of the world is not real. Non-American humans are not real. We are as fictional as any of the characters in Game of Thrones.
So where do we go from here?
Honestly, this is something I've been struggling for quite a while.
Hmm.
I like what's it like? I don't know. I'm no longer a teenager where I believe in the possibility of the global proletariat revolution. Um, at the same time, I'm not let's say, amoral enough to simply throw out the literally very good beliefs that I have developed over my whole life. that have led me to being a socialist and a leftist. Um, but fact is, our world is going to be a lot darker. Like I have a family that's going to be coming soon. Um, I know that's true for many people, and we have to live in this world. What do we do? You keep living, you keep fighting for the things that you believe in, and you keep punching the fascists in the face when you get the chance. Uh, there's nothing else we can do. There like participate in the political process. If you live in a country where that's possible. If you don't live in a country, if you live in a country where that's not possible, learn to kill government officials. Um, quite frankly, the world is becoming violent. Like you people have must get over their aversion to violence. Violence used in the name of defending the weak is right and good and just and should be celebrated. When a bully is bullying someone smaller and weaker, the response should not be to get the weaker person to suck the bully's dick. The response should be to help the bully, the weaker person punch the bully in the face until they stop bullying. This works just as well on the schoolyard as it does in geopolitics, as it does in our personal lives. That's the only thing we can do is try and figure out how best we could possibly contribute to stopping all the fucking assholes that keep picking on everyone.
I mean, this is, yeah, it's kind of perfect because my last question for you was you mentioned in the last episode of Ukraine Without Hype, which of course or at least the last one I listened to, which of course I recommend people listen to the podcast as well, that like there has to be concrete action, and you were talking to Americans specifically in that case, like there has to be concrete actions to stop the Trump administration, and that requires all the cards that are available and obviously people make their own assessments or whatever. But like there has to be this understanding that this is not just something to weather for the next 4 years because something can. There's still this notion, as I'm sure you know, that
Yeah,
like
you
basically we
can't
just need to
tune out
survive
and
four
just
years.
watch. Yeah, exactly. You can't tune out
Hmm.
and just watch The Daily Show and
Hmm.
watch funny TikToks of people making fun of Trump. That's not going to stop the deportations. That's not
Hmm.
going to stop the mass viral deaths that will come from, the destruction of the entire vaccine infrastructure of the United States. It's not going to stop the Mexican invasion. What will stop them is physical action. And whether that's kinetic, forceful action, whether that's just showing up to a place and blocking the entrance with your body, it doesn't matter. It will take that. Yes, you will have to risk your own physical safety, your family's physical safety, because it's going to be at risk anyway. And either that risk will come, like, either you handle that risk by taking action that may resolve it, that may lessen it, or you just resign yourself to no longer being free. Uh, the entire Enlightenment was developed on the fact that humans generally, in theory, we prefer being free to the alternative. We like being free so much we are willing to fight and kill and die for it. Uh, like I say, people like have to choose for themselves, but to be quite honest, if you would prefer to be a slave, you aren't fit to be a member of a liberal democracy. The defense of freedom has to be a paramount value for every single one of us, or this whole democracy shit doesn't work. Like, fuck it. Find whatever bloodline you want, put a fucking crown on them, give them a fucking throne, and start bowing. Like those are your options. There's no fucking middle room here.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I of course I agree. Um, I've been, like one thing that I've been thinking about as well, and maybe I'll end on this point and I'll ask you to end on the note that you want to end on as well. But like for me, there's some silver lining in everything that's happening in the sense that, and this is like with all of the caveats that this comes with, in the sense that there's a lot of chaos within the far right in the US and elsewhere, and this is something that can be exploited. They are making lots of mistakes. They are regretting some of them. They're not regretting most of them, of course, because they're shielded from the consequences. But there are things that people can do, basically, in terms of whether if your social security check is going to be late, which in the case of the US is certainly going to happen, or the next wildfire is going to be so much worse because they cut funding for all of the firefighters or anything like that. Um, there's going to be a lot of things that are going to push people over the edge effectively. And I think the role of well, I'm not in the US, but like the lot of people who are in a capacity to do things should be at the very least to prepare or to even mentally or within community with other people talk about it to prepare for these moments because these moments are going to come at you whether you want to or not. And the decision is not whether you want it to happen or not. The decision is like how ready are you for it or not. And for me, this is something that I at least hold some hope, if you want, in the sense that I do see people thinking more and more along these lines, and that is at least something that I can work with. Because the alternative, obviously, is that I just sit back, and that is the opposite of what I would like to do, as I'm sure you would agree. With all of that said, is there anything else we could have got into, but we haven't?
Um, I don't know if haven't I just I was just thinking you were saying that you would like to see this like you would also like to be active and I was thinking honestly let the Americans fucking solve their problems like fucking let them solve it and I know like maybe that's a callous thing to say maybe that's a dumb thing to say but I'm so fucking tired of that country. I'm so tired of all of their shit. They cause this problem. They want to be isolationist. They want to withdraw from the world. They want to withdraw from NATO, the UN, the WTO, fucking everything. Let them. Let them fucking wall that entire fucking worthless piece of shit off. And if that they want to fucking kill themselves behind the fucking walls that they built, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of people, and I love a lot of people. There's a lot of very, very, very amazing people in the U.S. And who are absolutely not at fault for anything that's going on. But that's the, I don't know, like that's what happens.
It,
Y'all fucked up. Y'all really fucked up, and they need to solve their problems. We have our own problems, and if they can just focus on solving theirs, and we'll focus on solving ours.
I do think
This is
uh,
a very emotional thing. Like I'm just tired of them. I'm just tired of it.
Yeah, I don't blame you. I mean, like, how can I? When the election happened, I posted something. I think it was on Blue Sky, like saying if I'm allowed one very unhelpful comment, which is that I'm really tired of having to give a shit about America.
Yeah.
There's an element of me that's always like, oh, the internationalism, and I will care about everyone, everywhere, and whatnot. But it's just so disproportionately toxic. I mean, I don't have to explain this, I'm sure, but like as someone who's Lebanese and Palestinian, not much good has come out of that for my people, and I just wish there was a way for the good that has come out of that world to be maintained, but the bad to be defeated. At this point, I just want people who are good in that country to have the tools that they need to fix things and to help things into whatever, and in whatever capacity I can, I'll help. But ultimately, as you said, it is really an internal struggle or whatever that has to occur because I mean the rest of the world is not going to do much. It can't even do much to help Americans fight Americans effectively.
Well, Joey, never say never. Could be in 10 years, you and I are going to be airdropping into New York City as some of the first journalists to visit America after it walled itself off in 2028.
Well, you're launching Radio Free America, so that can come in handy by now.
It's part of the plans. I'm planning pretty like I'm pretty far ahead. I don't know if it's because I like learned that my wife is pregnant. I'm gonna be a dad soon, but I started thinking I started thinking in long terms.
I understand. I understand.
Before
I've been
that,
doing.
like I'd like fuck, I don't give a shit what happens tomorrow, next month. And now I'm like 10, 15, 20 years down the road. I know what's going on. I know what
I
I'm
do.
gonna be
I
doing.
I generally do the same because I have a 16 months old. I think in terms of like, oh shit, in 18 years we're going to be in like the 2030s, even the 2040s, and like that's gonna be wild, all of that. But like, yeah, it does change things certainly.
We have a world
Any,
like
yeah,
we've a reason to fix the world. Well, not a
we do.
reason. We have an obligation to.
We absolutely do. This is like, I mean, I can end on a Baldwin thing. Like, you cannot tell a kid that there's no hope. And that's just like not something that one should do. So like we better work to make sure we don't have to tell them that.
Correct.
Um, okay, any pluggables? Anything you want to share with our audiences, our listeners, lovely listeners?
As always, I've been Romeo Kokriatski. You can listen to me at Ukraine Without Hype, the best Ukraine English language Ukrainian podcast where we talk about top headlines in Ukraine and the region. We're also launching a new project called Radio Free America. Uh, which will be focused on debunking the various disinformation, misinformation coming out of mainstream legacy media and
You want to
talking about
explain
what
that
the truths
reference?
are.
You want to explain the reference of Radio Free America for those who don't know?
Oh yes, for listeners who may not know, the United States throughout the Cold War and into the modern era ran a program called Radio Free Europe. Radio Free, lots of places basically. It was radio that they would beam into during the Cold War, communist countries after the Cold War, just basically everywhere. That would usually give a more accurate view of things than whatever domestic state propaganda engine had control over the media apparatus in the given country. It was a lot of dissidents have talked about how Radio Free Europe especially inspired them, how it helped them stay connected to the greater world, and how it helped them stay informed, gave them hope at times. And I think with the almost inevitable decline of America into a dictatorship, a fascist dictatorship, I can think of no other suitable project to start developing than a resource that will help give Americans real, true, and accurate information, and maybe even a little bit of hope. You can
Yeah,
also,
amen.
uh, and finally, I am the managing editor of the New Voice of Ukraine, an English language Ukrainian newspaper. And you can read us at english.nv.ua. That's english.nv.ua.
I'll of course put all of these links in the show notes. And on my side, folks, if you want to follow me, don't. I'm joking. Yeah, I'm on Blue Sky. It's Ayoub at or dot whatever BSKY, the usual shit. I'm also on Mastodon, but I'm less active. It's also Ayoub at sport.social. I have a newsletter called ontologies.net. Haven't written in a month, but I hope to start again soon. Having a toddler, shockingly, is not conducive to creative writing. But I am doing my best. I'm not done. It's just slower. And of course, this is the Fridays Times. We're part of From the Periphery Media Collective, and you can support us if you don't already on patreon.com/From the Periphery. So yeah, with that in mind, Romeo, buddy, mate, thanks for coming on again.
Thanks for having me on. I'm always happy to be here.